We're talking about asset protection planning, and this is really in the context of long-term care. So we're not looking about hiding our assets on offshore countries so that we can avoid our creditors. We're really just looking to try and take savings that people have accumulated, and they're worried about having to spend all of that on the cost of long-term care. Usually they're thinking nursing homes, but I'm increasingly thinking more about in-home care costs as much as I am costs in a nursing environment. So we're going to take a look at asset protection, and this little slide is kind of, which you can't read, which is intentional, kind of our universe of long-term care asset protection planning. And what we're really going to be doing is trying to make sure, not so much to protect assets, but to make sure that those assets are available to be spent on the things that you're going to need when you need them. If you're married, we're very interested in making sure that your spouse has some financial security, because it's a little unnerving to think that you would have saved up all this money. One person in the relationship needs long-term care. All the money gets spent for them, and there's nothing left for the surviving or healthier spouse. We also are looking to try and maintain eligibility for government benefits. That's important because government benefits like Medicaid are the primary source of funding for long-term care in this country. As many of the people who are worried about spending their own savings on long-term care, the government's outlay for long-term care is substantially higher, because as a society we simply don't have enough savings to cover the cost of our long-term care. So most people who need long-term care will eventually wind up transitioning over to Medicaid to pay for that care. And we want to make sure in the planning work that we're doing in advance of all of that, that we have not done anything that would either inadvertently or perhaps deliberately blow their eligibility for those programs. And as it turns out, that's one of the main tricks of asset protection planning. The last thing we're trying to do is to pass wealth on to the next generation. So a lot of people come in and they're thinking about, well, I want to save the money so that, mom and dad's assets that they worked so hard for and they really meant to come to me will come to me. And that may be true, and that may be what motivates the child to come in and talk to me, but that's not what motivates me to do the planning. That's on my list of things to take care of, fourth on the list, not top of the list. Passing on wealth to the next generation is great if we can accomplish that, but it's an extra added kind of gravy thing for me, not the primary purpose for doing asset protection planning. What you're really trying to do is protect the assets that people have saved and allow those assets to be used for the people that saved the money and to be used in as efficient and productive a way as possible. We're essentially just trying to get a bigger bang for our buck, not to transfer all our wealth over to somebody else so that we get to live in a cardboard box. That would not, in my opinion, be a particularly good plan. I have had clients who were much more inclined to put themselves in a box so that their children could get money, but ultimately that has a nasty way of backfiring anyway. Even when people get what they want on that score, it usually doesn't work out as well as they would like it to. You guys have already taken the first step in the planning process, which is at least to try and gain a little information about what's involved. Most people will not do any planning in this area at all until they are in the nursing home. The majority of calls that I get are from people in the hospital who are literally within minutes going to be discharged out of the hospital into a nursing home. It has suddenly dawned on them that they're going to be spending a lot of money for that care, and they want to know what they can do to protect their assets. That's kind of like falling off your motorcycle and then looking around to put your helmet on. Or getting your smallpox vaccine after you've already contracted smallpox. You have to do this planning well in advance, which means you have to overcome the things that are on this slide. People don't like to think about what it's going to be what it's going to be like to get old, and what they'll have to go through, and what they may have to spend their money on. So they just, as a result of not liking to think about it, They just don't think about it. They think that they'll always be healthy. Well, they're not. They may at the same time be complaining about some new ache or pain that has suddenly developed. I find myself now complaining about aches and pains that I've developed. And I'm thinking to myself, it's already happening. So if you decided, well, yeah, that's all going on, but somehow I'm going to stay healthy enough that I'm not going to need long-term care, I can all but assure you, you're wrong. You will need the long-term care. Almost everyone does, except for those lucky people who get hit by Mack trucks or struck by lightning or die from very sudden and acute illnesses. In my world, those are the lucky people. It's kind of hard on the families, but it's pretty easy on the people by comparison to being elderly in a nursing home. Some people don't like to plan because they're worried that it's expensive. That's kind of a false premise, because what you're saying is, well, I'm worried about having to spend all this money on my long-term care, and so I've decided that in order to solve that problem, I'm not going to spend any money to solve that problem. I'm just going to do nothing, which is a self-fulfilling demise, really. It is expensive to do long-term care planning if you do it well, but generally speaking, the money that you're spending is substantially less than the money that you should be saving. And another way of looking at it is, if you're going to end up wiping out all your savings paying for long-term care, the money you're so interested in protecting has already been spent. You're really just changing where you're spending it. So, yeah, if you spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 putting together a long-term care plan for yourself, that $10,000 represents 1 month of nursing home care. And if in the process you've managed to shelter $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000, and that will vary depending upon how much you have to begin with, well, that's, in my opinion, $10,000 well spent. But for some people, they'll look at that and say, well, that's too much money. I would prefer to spend $200,000 or $300,000. That sounds cheaper to me, I guess. I don't know. It's hard for me to understand that. The planning seems complicated. I don't really understand all of this stuff. So, well, that may be a function of the fact that you're working with people who can't explain complicated things to you in a way that you can understand. But it is complicated. If just anybody could do this, they would just do this. You wouldn't be coming out to seminars to learn about it. You just kind of know it. You'd watch it on some sitcom on a Saturday afternoon or something, and you'd figure it all out. So it is complicated. It's intended to be complicated because you're trying to accomplish something that the laws of our society have said you shouldn't be trying to accomplish. You should just spend all your money until you don't have any more, and then we'll take care of you. That's the deal. If you don't like that deal, well, then you're going to try and go out on your own, and we're not going to necessarily make that particularly easy for you. So you're the salmon swimming upstream rather than the fish that's just going with the current wherever the current would take you. You will find in asset protection planning that a lot of this involves some loss of control over your assets. And so when people find out about that, they'll say, oh, well, gee, that doesn't sound so good to me. I don't like that loss of control. Well, when you spend all of your money on long-term care, you will have lost control over your money. So the loss of control, in one sense, either happens on your terms or it happens on somebody else's terms, but the idea that you don't get to lose control isn't really an option. Sometimes families are in conflict, and that can complicate the planning process because as we'll find out, a lot of asset protection planning involves placing some trust in members of our family. And if you're a family in conflict, these options may not be as good for you as they would be in a family that was, Walton-like, and everyone's working along and getting along very nicely. If you're not living amongst the Waltons, you may have a harder time with some of this. The last thing that causes people to not do this kind of planning is they have a hard time figuring out whose advice to follow and who to trust in this process. You'll come here, you'll hear me say things, you'll go somewhere else, someone else will say something completely different, and you're thinking, well, the first guy sounded like maybe he knew what he was talking about. The second guy sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And I went to see this third lady, and she said something different altogether, and she sounded like she knew what she was talking about. All I know is I don't know what I'm talking about, and I can't tell which of these three people are giving me the straight story and which of them are misinformed or misapplying their information to my situation. I don't know what to do. And so in the midst of that, I will just do nothing. And I don't know that that's a bad reaction to have, but, it happens. And so, what you're trying to accomplish is to gain a little bit of information so that you can weigh the information you're going to receive from various sources, people like me. And, you're going to try and figure out, well, what's this guy selling? And what's he not selling? And, if he can explain to me clearly why I should be doing something, well, maybe I'll feel a little better about that advice than I would somebody who tells me what to do but can't necessarily tell me why I should be doing it. And I will tell you, this is very fact-specific. Asset protection planning and estate planning in general is not something that you don't buy it off the rack, as it were. This is something that will depend tremendously on your circumstances, your health, your family dynamics, the nature of the assets that you have, and your goals and objectives for what you're trying to accomplish. I was talking today with a guy who's a financial planner. He predominantly works in the life insurance market. And we're working with a common client, and she has some insurance policies. I've never seen policies like these things before. She can't transfer the ownership of these policies. And I'm talking to the guy, I'm like, you're kidding me. Why can't she just change the ownership of the policy? That'd be fine. Why can't we do this and do that and do this? These particular policies, you can't do that with. I've been doing planning for 25 years. I've never encountered a situation like that before. So in her situation, what seemed like it was going to be a very straightforward kind of a garden variety asset protection plan has now turned into something very, very different, simply because she years ago bought some rather, what are now appearing to be like not such a great life insurance products, which don't, as it turned out, dovetail well into the normal planning models. So it's very fact-specific. Avoid talking to your neighbors over the backyard fences and saying, well, Steve said he did this for his mom, therefore we're going to go do that too, because what worked for Steve and his mom may not very well work for you. Unless you know everything there is to know about what Steve's mom was up to, you cannot be confident that the result that they got will be the result that you'll get. There are two types of planning: advanced planning and crisis planning. Advanced planning is generally what we're going to talk about tonight, but we will talk about at least one crisis planning technique. I used to talk about crisis planning a lot more than I talked about advanced planning because I had more things to talk about, but they continuously change the law, and each change that we've had of late has eliminated one or more crisis planning techniques. So at this point, fortune truly does favor those who plan ahead. Advanced planning, I think, offers greater certainty of success. It's not at all guaranteed, though, because the law does change, and what we did in 2014 in December may not work under the law as it exists in July of 2018. We hope that it will, and most often we're going to be grandfathered in based on whatever the law was when we took action, but not always, and there's no guarantee of that. So that's, one of the certainties that you have in advanced planning. There may not be as many certainties. With crisis planning, you have many fewer options, but you're working under the law that exists right now. I know what the rules are. It's easier for me to play with those rules and figure out what I can and cannot accomplish. I'm not vulnerable to changes in the law over time. Advanced planning is still your better option, but it's not without a certain amount of drawbacks.